Hello, my name is Sean Fry, and I will be presenting on the topic of corporate criminal liability. Overall, this is a presentation all about how the ideas of corporate punishments got flipped and turned upside down. I'd like to take a minute, maybe about 10, please just focus right here, and I'll provide a brief review about how corporate treatments for crimes became slightly more fair. This presentation will be broken down into 7 main topics. The first being the definition of corporate criminal liability. The second, a brief background on the topic. Third, the legal history, again, brief. Fourth, the modern day application. Fifth, some ethical considerations. Sixth, arguments for and against corporate criminal liability. And lastly, the references that I used to compile this presentation. A definition for corporate criminal liability was kind of hard to come by during my research. I was able to find a pretty good definition from US Legal, and that definition was that corporate criminal liability is the liability imposed upon a corporation for any criminal act done by any natural person. The liability is imposed so as to regulate the acts of a corporation. And any corporation can be made liable for its acts or the acts of its agents or servants if he or she 1. Commits a crime, 2. Acts within the scope of their employment, and 3. That crime was committed with the intent to benefit the corporation. The first instance of corporate criminal liability I was able to find dated back from England in the 1600s, but more recently, 18th century common law believed that a corporation cannot commit treason or felony or other crime in its corporate capacity, though its members may in their distinct individual capacities. In the 19th century, the application of modern-day corporate criminal liability was often in the realm of slavery, on the doctrine of respondent superior. And that basically stated that the consequences for the actions of a slave could be laid down on that owner of that same said slave. Today, this theory applies sort of the same doctrine, but with a different relationship, and that being that of the subordinate and the superior. And it's known under a different name, that of vicarious liability. So a brief legal history, the first reference I could find was the Elkins Act, and it was the first legal reference in the United States with the idea that a corporation could be responsible for criminal activity. The Elkins Act was from 1903, and it was in addition to the Interstate Commerce Act, and it basically stated and regulated that the pricing for common carrier fares had to be the same regardless of the routes being traveled. And this basically had to do with amount of money per weight, not the fact that nowadays we pay more money to go further places. That's just basic economics. The first establishment of corporate criminal liability within the language in the Elkins Act came from a portion that says that acts done by any director or officer thereof, or any receiver, trustee, lessee, agent, or person acting for or employed by such corporation would constitute a misdemeanor under said act or under this act, and shall be also held to a misdemeanor committed by such from the corporation. Basically, that translates to any act that's taken criminally by an individual of a corporation can also be referred to that same corporation. The Elkins Act isn't as well known. What is well known is what's referred to as the New York Central case. And the New York Central case is officially the New York Central and Hudson River Road Company versus United States, and this is back from 1909. And what this act actually did, it was a challenge against the Elkins Act. The manager and assistant traffic managers had agreed to an illegal rebate of 5 cents off of their published price of 23 cents per 100 pounds to ship large amounts of sugar from New York to Detroit. The New York Central and Hudson River Railroad Company was found guilty and appealed, and the higher court found them upheld the ruling, and then they appealed that as well, and that went to the state Supreme Court, which upheld the ruling, and then the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. And the US Supreme Court ultimately upheld the same ruling. And in their decision, the justices stated that it is true that there are some crimes which in their nature cannot be committed by corporations, but there is a large class of offenses wherein the crime consists of purposely doing things prohibited by statute. In that class of crimes, we see no good reason why corporations may not be held responsible for and charged with the knowledge and purposes of their agents, acting within the authority conferred upon them. If it were not so, many offenses might go unpunished and acts be committed in violation of law. Whereas if in the present case, the statute requires all persons, corporate or private, to refrain from certain practices, forbidden in the interest of public policy. In the modern application of corporate criminal liability, in my research, I found that it varied nation to nation. Some nations don't believe that corporations can be liable for their acts. Other nations have more strict penalties than that of the United States. The U.S. practice, interestingly, applies to U.S.-based companies, U.S. chartered companies, as well as companies that are operating on U.S. soil in some cases. It varied depending on the severity of the case. Under U.S. law, corporations may be subject to liability for the actions of a wide range of employees, all the way up from director positions, CEOs, from managers, all the way down to a low-level grunt employee. One very landmark case in corporate criminal liability was the Pfizer case from 2009. And in the Pfizer case, executives and sales members were illegally marketing a number of drugs. During the course of the investigation, after whistleblowers came forward and informed the commission that this was happening, it was found that the corporate culture was being pushed down, that not only were illegal acts okay if it generated profits, but that if you weren't doing these illegal acts, that you were actually not a team player. And one whistleblower actually quoted as stating that the culture was sales driven. If you didn't sell the drugs illegally, then you weren't a team player. The Pfizer case was considered landmark because it was the largest penalty imposed criminally against a corporation, amount of $1.195 billion in criminal penalties. In addition to that, the company forfeit $105 million and paid over $1 billion under the Civil False Claims Act, as well as $102 million to settle civil complaints resulting from their illegal marketing of said drugs. In addition to the fact that simply violating what are societally accepted as laws is unethical, there's a couple other items to consider. The first is that can an entity legally only in name even be said to have committed a crime? And if so, what punishment would actually be fair based on the fact that the entity is not an individual, does not have a self-conscious, and going forward, how do you measure the severity? If you think, for instance, about the recession in 2008, consider the millions of dollars that were lost by people from their life savings accounts, from retirement accounts, and eventually even lives were lost as a result of those financial losses. How do you punish a non-concrete entity? Secondly, criminal refers to a person traditionally or group of people. By applying a criminal tag to, again, a non-concrete entity, are we therefore comparing the corporation and an individual? And are they equivalent? And if so, do they have the same unalienable rights that are referenced within the Declaration of Independence? Today, there's still many arguments for and against corporate criminal liability. It's still a heated topic. A couple of the main arguments for have to do with the level of corporate power, being that corporations nowadays are so large that they wield more power and authority for change than almost any single one person that I can think of globally. Their individual actions, their corporate actions, affect not only their stockholders, but the market as a whole. A corporate or industry collapse can cripple national economies, as we've seen recently with the 2008 recession in the United States and then Greece and Ireland. Another is the institutionalization. So when you consider that one of the largest institutions in the world is a corporation, the term institutionalization has to do with the culture and the norms coming from that quote-unquote institution and being forced down on, whether on purpose or just vicarious through into an individual who works for that said corporation. So the corporation, how are they going to be held responsible? And they need to be held responsible for the institutionalization that they are providing to the citizens. The largest argument, though, is a deterrent. If you think about the Pfizer case and you look at the large amount of money that Pfizer had to pay in penalties, does that deter from other corporations breaking laws, knowingly breaking laws, or encouraging their employees to knowingly break laws? Couple arguments against. First, we've already addressed this, but a lot of people believe that the laws can only be applicable to artificial persons, not to non-artificial persons such as a corporation. But the largest argument against corporate criminal liability is that it punishes innocent shareholders. If you think about it, a person like you or me may own stock if we're lucky. If not, we own stock in a mutual fund that owns stock in these companies. When these companies are found guilty and are penalized, like Pfizer, $1 billion, your share price plummets. And therefore, your equity and your valuation that you have plummets. Is that fair to what are considered innocent shareholders who had nothing to do, had no idea that any of these crimes were going on? We're not in those board meetings. Is it fair that we are punished to that same level? This actually was just a bumper sticker that I saw on a car about 6 weeks ago before we had to pick a topic, which made me decide on my topic. I found it kind of funny and found it appropriate. Here's my list of references that were used for this presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, I can be reached at my email located within the class. Thank you again.